Hello and welcome. I'm so happy that you have joined me here today. We are continuing in our study of the book of Nehemiah. Last week we just did the introduction to the book, and this week we'll actually be getting into the text. We'll be looking at Nehemiah chapter 1. So grab yourself a cuppa and we'll get started. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and look forward to reading some of your comments. So Nehemiah chapter 1 verse 1. The words of Nehemiah son of Hakaliah. In the month of Kislev, in the 12th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa, Hanani, one of my brothers, came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile, and also about Jerusalem. So who was Nehemiah? In the first verse of the chapter, we're introduced to the main character of this book, Nehemiah. Nehemiah was from the tribe of Judah, so he was a Jewish exile living in Susa, which was the capital of Persia at the time. Nehemiah was a Jewish leader who supervised the rebuilding of Jerusalem, so we'll see that later on in this study. And it was in the mid-5th century BC, after the release from captivity from the Persian king Artaxerxes I. And he's also instituted some moral reforms and rededicating the Jews to the Lord. So we see that later on in the latter chapters of Nehemiah. So we're introduced to Nehemiah. The name Nehemiah is of Hebrew origin, and it means God's comfort. Comforted by God, and it is derived from the Hebrew word which means comfort, and of course the Yah at the end of Nehemiah, Nehemiah, the Yah is referring to God. The first verse talks about being in the month of Kislev. So Kislev is the 9th month in the Hebrew calendar. It typically corresponds to the Gregorian calendar being November and December. So why was Nineveh an Israelite in the city of Susa and not in Israel? So Nehemiah was in the citadel of Susa because he had held a position of influence as cupbearer to the king of Artaxerxes. He was not in Israel at this time because the Jewish people had been in exile in Babylon, and many, like Nehemiah, had established their lives and their positions in the Persian Empire. Nehemiah had a heart for his homeland, Judah, Jerusalem, Israel, and the Promised Land. He cared deeply for his people, the Jews. And when his brother Hanani arrived from Judah, Nehemiah took the opportunity to learn about the Jewish remnant that had survived the exile and about the condition of Jerusalem. So Nehemiah, he questioned them about the Jewish remnant and who had survived, and also about Jerusalem. So in Christian circles, we hear that word exile so frequently, it starts to lose its significance. So take a moment to appreciate what it would be like for a whole nation to be relocated to another enemy nation. Imagine for a while, or consider the experience of those living in Ukraine just in recent years, or in Syria in 2013. And if you're old enough, maybe Ethiopia in the 1980s. Everything you know is destroyed. Everyday items like food and transport and culture are drastically altered. Your home nation is destroyed, and all your significant monuments and your buildings are just leveled to the ground. The skilled and the educated people are taken captive by the enemy nation, and the vulnerable, the sick, the elderly, the disabled, the lowly people are callously left behind in the rubble to fend for themselves in a defenseless city with no infrastructure. So I think Nehemiah must have been a compassionate and thoughtful man, because he considered those who were left in Jerusalem after exile. And the primary group had taken from Judah to the Babylonian captivity under King Nebuchadnezzar were the elite. They were the skilled individuals, included royalty and priests and officials and scribes and craftsmen. And additionally, the wealthy citizens and those considered influential were also deported. And the Babylonians aimed to weaken Judah's resilience and integrate them into the population of Babylon society. And after the Babylonian exile, the people remaining in Jerusalem and Judea were primarily the poorest and the most vulnerable members of society, including those who were not considered elite or influential. But Nehemiah, he cared enough for those vulnerable Jews left behind in Israel, and he inquired about them. Verse 3, and they said to me, those who survived the exile are back and are in the province in great trouble and disgrace, and the walls of Jerusalem are broken down and its gates have been burned with fire. And when I heard these things, I sat down and I wept. And for days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. So Nehemiah, he hears a very concerning report from his friend. The Jewish people in Jerusalem are in great trouble and disgrace. And the great wall that was built around to protect Jerusalem from invaders is now a pile of rubble, and the large, strong, wooden gates have been burnt to ashes. The town is vulnerable because it has no protection from invaders, and they no longer have confidence that they can withstand any enemy attack. Any gang of thugs could just roam at night and wreak havoc inside that city, and the citizens would have had to be vigilant all the time. So besides being part of a city's protection against invaders, the city gates were a place of central activity in biblical times. It was at the city gates where important business and transactions were settled. A court was convened and public announcements were made. And now, without these cities' gates, that functioned as centres of commerce and government, we see the destruction of the city's culture and social and commercial infrastructure. And without a wall, it's hardly a city at all. It's just a collection of homes just built together. Nehemiah, he uses this phrase, in great trouble and disgrace, and it conveys distress and shame. It would have been stressful living in a city without a wall, and people would have had to live in constant fear of invasion. Nehemiah 1 verse 4, it says that he hears the report and he allows himself to feel the gravity of this situation. He sat down and wept. And for a number of days he mourned and he fasted and he prayed. And we often see in biblical references that the fasting is coupled with prayer. God was going to use Nehemiah to do something about this situation, but first God had to do something in the heart of Nehemiah. So any great work of God begins with a great work in somebody's heart. God prepared this a long time ago, with Nehemiah's important position being in Persia, and with a heart that was curious for the welfare of Jerusalem and its people. God would do something great to meet the need through Nehemiah. And we should note that, as well as what Nehemiah didn't do, so we're going to look at what he did do, but it's interesting to see what he didn't do. Nehemiah, he didn't complain, he didn't whine, he didn't see who else could fix the problem instead of him. He immediately did what he knew he could do. He prayed. He intensely sought the Lord on this situation. And when Nehemiah learned that the people of God were in dire straits, he didn't spring into action and try to take matters into his own hands, nor did he surrender to despair, declaring the situation to be a hopeless cause. Instead, he immediately entered into a time of mourning, fasting, and prayer. And this should be how we respond when we hear that God's people are in trouble. Nehemiah, he models a way that should characterize all believers as a personal connection with God and a passionate concern for God's people. It is encouraging to see that Nehemiah's first response after receiving the distressing news of the state of Jerusalem is to pray. And it's just a reminder of what we need to do as well. When we face our personal struggles, or if we're stirred by something disturbing news, our immediate reaction should be to pray. Nehemiah, he was a man of prayer, and the book of Nehemiah contains a number of Nehemiah's prayers, short ones and long ones, and we'll look at each one of these prayers as we come across them. And so this is his prayer, and we're going to look at it verse by verse. Verse 5, "Then I said, Lord, the God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps covenant of love with those who love him and keep his commandments." And so this section, Nehemiah also provides a helpful model of prayer. Nehemiah's prayers are rooted in an awareness of both God's character and his promises. He acknowledges that not only is God's position as ruler, he says, Lord, the God of the heaven, and the great and awesome God, but he also acknowledges the nature as his nature as a covenant keeper. He's a covenant maker and he's a covenant keeper. So next, Nehemiah confesses both personal and national sins. In verse 6 and 7, he prays, "Let your ear be attentive and your eyes be open to hear the prayer of your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's family, have committed before you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands and decrees and the laws you gave your servant Moses." So Nehemiah identified with his fellow Jews. He refers to them as your servants, your people of Israel. And by taking he takes ownership of the corporate sin and confessing that we have committed sin against you, and acknowledges their failure to keep God's commandments, statutes, and rules. And then he bases his request on the principles and the promises and the covenants set forth in God's word, because he is a covenant-keeping God. Verse 8, "Remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, 'If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exile people are in the farthest horizons, I will gather them from there and bring them to a place where I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. And they are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand.'" So Nehemiah, he believed God for the fulfillment of his covenantal promises, to gather his people and to restore them. He based his belief on God's promise, on his covenant, and on his faithfulness, reminding God of his word to gather these scattered people and bring them back to Jerusalem if they had returned and repented to him. Then and only then does Nehemiah make his request known. Verse 11, "Let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man." So Nehemiah is asking God to give him success and favor with the king of Persia, so he can rebuild Jerusalem's walls. In this verse marks the start of an intercessory prayer driven by compassion for his people's distress and the hope in God's promises and restoration. His prayer is specific and it's bold, and it's without being sort of outcome-based. Too often we tell God exactly what we want him to do or what we want to see happen, and how and when and how we want it to unfold. But Nehemiah, he doesn't do that. And all we have to do is to ask for help and believe that as we are faithful to carry out God's promises, God will provide all the resources we need. And Nehemiah, he understood this as well. Nehemiah's prayer is very similar to the components of the Lord's Prayer that we see in Matthew 6, verses 9 to 13. And as we look at the prayer of Nehemiah 1, we can see how many components we see similar to the Lord's Prayer. We see Nehemiah says, "the Father of heaven," and it mirrors the phrase God of heaven in the Lord's Prayer. He praises God with "hallowed be your name." We see that in the Lord's Prayer. He confesses sin, and so in the Lord's Prayer we see "forgive our debts," and Nehemiah has a call or a request for help, and in the Lord's Prayer we see a specific request for daily bread. So there's a lot of parallels. It's an interesting study between the two prayers. And the last part is Nehemiah says in verse 11b, "I was the cupbearer of the king." So this was a very high-ranking official position, and it required Nehemiah's presence in the royal court every day. And it probably would have been long days as well. So a cupbearer to the king was someone of high status who the king would have trusted with his very life. The occasional hazard for kings was being poisoned, and therefore it was important to have a very loyal person guarding the cup that the king drank wine from. The king's cupbearer was a significant position in the ancient royal court. And the cupbearer was kind of like a personal bodyguard to the king, being the one who tasted the wine and the food before the king did, so making certain no one could poison the king. So a commentator called Kinder, he says the cupbearer was a high official in the royal household whose basic duty of choosing and tasting the wine demonstrated that it was not poison, and the presenting of it to the king gave him frequent access to the king's presence and made him potentially a man of influence. So the king therefore had to have tremendous amount of trust in this cupbearer, who was a man. He'd have to be faithful, and he'd have to have an impressive character. And if the cupbearer could be turned against the king, then an assassination would be very easy. The cupbearer also had to be a servant of the king. He was responsible for choosing the foods and the wines that the king and the court would enjoy. The cupbearer was also a trusted advisor to the king, since he constantly was in the king's presence. He was greatly trusted, a man of character, and so it was natural for the cupbearer would often be asked his opinion on difficult matters coming before the king. So that was Nehemiah's position in the Persian Empire. So that's all I have for you from Nehemiah chapter 1. It's been a pleasure again spending time with you, and I look forward to when we cover Nehemiah chapter 2 next week. Bye.